What would you do if you found something that shouldn't exist? In January of 2004, a group of volunteers was walking along a riverbank in the Chapada dos Veadeiros highlands when they saw it. Exposed roots clutching something that time had tried to bury. It was a heavy roll of yellow tarpaulin, bound by rusted chains with stones lashed to its ends. Inside, 4 years of silence were about to speak. And a question no one could answer would finally be asked. Who had bound this thing that the river had kept for so long? The photograph had been there, tucked away in a family album since November of 2000. Rogério Silva Mendes, a 58-year-old retired analyst from Eletrobras, held the straps of his navy blue backpack, a calm smile on his face. Beside him, Lídia Marques Mendes, 57, a retired public school art teacher, adjusted a necklace of dark beads as she looked at the camera with her usual, slightly timid gaze. It was late afternoon at the entrance to Chapada dos Veadeiros. The sky, heavy with clouds, cast a diffuse light over the Cerrado landscape, where wooden signs pointed to trails they knew by heart. They had been here twice before, but always as day trippers. This time would be different. They wanted to hear the sound of the Preto River in the dead of night, to wake to the song of birds among the rocks, to smell the damp earth mixed with the smoke of a campfire. Their gear is all there in the photo. His large 60-liter pack has a green sleeping pad tied to the bottom and a yellow one rolled on top. A translucent blue water bottle dangles from a simple carabiner, the kind you'd buy at a camping store in Brasilia. Lídia had chosen a smaller beige backpack, better suited to her frame, with an aluminum canteen half hidden in a side pocket, and the chest strap adjusted over her red and blue floral blouse. They had lived in Brasilia's Asa Norte for over 20 years, in a 2-bedroom apartment where Lídia kept her students' artwork on a wooden bookshelf and Rogério organized topographical maps in hanging files. They had no children, but they shared this passion for the trails of the Central Plateau. They started with weekend walks at Ermida Dom Bosco, then moved on to the waterfalls of Braslandia, until they discovered the Chapada on a holiday in 1998. The plan for that long weekend was simple. Leave Brasilia early on Friday, get to the town of Alto Paraíso before noon, buy last-minute supplies and enter the park while it was still light. They wanted to avoid the long holidays when the trails were crowded with noisy people who left trash behind. They preferred the Chapada in its quieter moments when you could walk for an entire hour without seeing another soul. Lídia's sister, who lived in Lago Sul, knew their itinerary. They had an old agreement. On their way back, they would call from a payphone in the village of São Jorge to let her know they were okay. Lídia never went anywhere remote without checking in, especially after a scare in 1999 when they got lost on a trail in Pirenópolis and only made it home in the middle of the night. Rogério was an experienced navigator, a skill he'd honed during his military service. He could read coordinates, calculate distances on a map, and always carried a compass in his pocket. Lídia handled the practicalities: food, medicine, plastic bags for trash, and a homemade insect repellent she brewed in their kitchen with andiroba oil. They were a balanced pair, each compensating for the other's limitations. The idea to spend the night near the Sete Quedas, the 7 Falls, had come to them during their last visit in September. They had arrived in the afternoon and were stunned by the sheer volume of water after the rains. Rogério had remarked how beautiful it must be to wake up to that constant sound of water crashing against the rocks. Lídia agreed but insisted they plan it properly. They weren't young anymore and they knew camping required preparation. For 2 months they overhauled their equipment. They tested the tent in the courtyard of their apartment building, checked that the sleeping bags were still waterproof, and bought new batteries for their flashlights. Rogério even took a basic first aid course at the Red Cross because Lydia worried about an emergency so far from help. The day before the trip, she prepared the dry food, instant noodles, saltine crackers, dehydrated fruit, instant coffee, and sugar, all packed in individual plastic-wrapped portions. Rogério checked the maps one last time and marked with a red pen the exact spot where they planned to pitch their tent. A small gravel beach about 300 meters from the falls, sheltered from the wind and with easy access to water. It was supposed to be a perfect weekend, simple, quiet, far from the rush of Brasilia. They couldn't have known that the photo in the album would be the last image of them alive. That Lydia's smile would be frozen forever in that cloudy November afternoon. Or that Rogério's blue backpack carried secrets that would only be discovered 4 years later, when the river decided to give back what it had swallowed. The morning of November 24th, 2000, started early in Asa Norte. Rogério woke at 5:30 as he had every day since retirement, but this time with a pleasant sense of anticipation. Lydia was already in the kitchen, making breakfast and checking her list for the third time. Their gray Palio had been loaded the night before. The backpacks took up the entire back seat, along with a bag of extra gear, ropes, a ground tarp, aluminum pots, a camping stove, and 3 small gas canisters. In the trunk, a cooler held water, sodas, and a few vegetables that wouldn't spoil easily: carrots, onions, sweet potatoes. The drive to Alto Paraíso took 2.5 hours. It was a road they knew well, but they always took their time, stopping at gas stations to drink water and stretch their legs. Rogério drove slowly, especially on the mountain curves, while Lydia watched the landscape change from low cerrado brush to the denser vegetation of the highlands. They arrived in town just after 10 in the morning. Alto Paraíso was busy for a weekday, with tourists buying last-minute gear. They picked up their planned supplies, screw-on gas canisters for the stove, candles, an extra box of matches, and fresh fruit from a corner market. At a stationery shop near the main square, they bought a laminated map of the region. The shopkeeper, a man in his 60s who knew the Chapada like the back of his hand, offered some advice. He said the summer rains were coming early that year, and it was wise to keep an eye on dark clouds. "A swollen river shows no mercy," he said as he wrapped the map in newspaper. At the park ranger station, they completed the mandatory registration. A clerk noted their full names, ID numbers, intended destination, and planned date of return. Rogério signed the visitor's log in his neat handwriting. Overnight near Sete Quedas. Return Sunday morning. The woman stamped 2 copies of the form and handed one to them. It was there they received their last official warning. The forecast indicated a chance of heavy rain between Saturday night and Sunday morning. The clerk suggested they stay alert and, if necessary, turn back sooner than planned. "The trail gets slippery in the rain," she explained, "and the river can rise fast." At 11:30, they entered the park. The guard at the gate gave their documents a final stamp and wished them a good hike. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only 2 other cars and a van belonging to a group of surfers heading to a different waterfall. The trail to the 7 falls began with a gentle climb through native trees. Rogério adjusted his pack and checked that his water bottle was secure. Lydia tied her hair back with a blue headband and applied sunscreen to her face and arms. The sun was strong, but the constant breeze of the Cerrado made the heat bearable. They walked at a comfortable pace, stopping now and then for water and photos. Another couple, who had been hiking nearby that day, would later provide crucial information for the investigation. In the photos they developed a week later, it was possible to see details of Rogério and Lydia's equipment: his blue water bottle resting on a smooth stone, her aluminum canteen reflecting the sun, a small camping pot beside a freshly lit fire. At 3:30, they reached the first viewpoint of the seven falls. The sound of the water was exactly as Rogério had imagined, constant, deep, mesmerizing. Lídia stood for a few minutes just listening and breathing in the moist air that rose from the rocks. "This is exactly what I wanted," she said, smiling. They followed a side trail down to the small beach they had marked on the map. It was just as they had hoped, a flat area of coarse gravel sheltered by a few trees with easy access to the water. It was perfect for the tent with no risk of flooding, yet close enough to hear the river through the night. They were methodical in setting up camp. First, they laid the tarp on the ground to protect the tent floor. Then they assembled the frame, checked that the stakes were firm, and organized their gear inside. The sleeping bags were unrolled to air out. The flashlights were placed within easy reach. The food was secured in plastic bags. By the time everything was done, it was after 5 in the afternoon. The clouds had thickened and the wind had shifted. Lídia remarked that it might rain during the night, but it was nothing to worry about. The tent had a rainfly, they had waterproof clothes, and they had enough experience to handle a little rain. Rogério lit the stove to prepare dinner. Simple pasta with seasonings Lídia had brought from home, accompanied by lemon balm tea. They ate slowly, talking about their plans for the next day. Wake up early, swim in the falls, hike to a lookout point they had seen on the map. When it grew completely dark around 7, they lit a campfire. They didn't need it for warmth, but they loved the ritual, gathering dry twigs, striking the first match, feeding the flames until they created a steady bed of embers. They sat there until almost 10 o'clock, just talking and listening to the night sounds of the chapada, frogs, crickets, the wind in the leaves, and ever-present the sound of water rushing over stones. It was the exact experience they had dreamed of during their months of planning. Before they retired to the tent, Lídia wrote in the small notebook where she recorded their trips. "Perfect day. Tomorrow we'll see the viewpoint." It would be her last entry. The night brought exactly what the forecast had predicted. Around 3 in the morning, the first heavy drops began to drum against the tent's rainfly. Rogério woke to the sound and listened for a few minutes, trying to gauge if it was just a passing shower or a real storm. The wind had changed completely. Where it had blown steadily from the east during the day, it now came in erratic gusts that shook the tent, making the guy lines snap taut and then go slack in a nervous rhythm. Lídia stirred in her sleeping bag and murmured something about the cold seeping in. Within 15 minutes, the passing shower had become a deluge. Water hammered against the tent fabric, streamed down the sides, and began to form small puddles around them. Rogério switched on his headlamp and checked for leaks. So far, so good, but he knew that mountain storms could last for hours. That's when they heard the first strange noise outside, a loud crack as if something large was moving through the trees. Lídia pressed against Rogério's arm and whispered, asking if he'd heard it too. He had, probably a large branch giving way under the weight of the water. At 4 in the morning, the situation grew serious. The rain was now so intense they could barely hear each other speak inside the tent. Worse, the sound of the river had changed. What had been a constant, soothing roar now sounded angrier, more urgent. Rogério knew enough about hydrology to understand what that meant. The water level was rising fast. They decided to get dressed and check outside. They put on their plastic ponchos, grabbed their flashlights, and unzipped the tent door. What they saw was not encouraging. The rain fell in a solid curtain, limiting their vision to just a few meters. The gravel beach was already covered by a sheet of water running down from higher ground. More alarmingly, the river was visibly higher and more violent, where its bank had been a safe 5 meters from their camp during the day. The muddy, churning water now rushed less than 2 meters from their tent. And it was still rising. Rogério made the only decision an experienced person could. They had to get out of there. They couldn't wait for dawn. At the rate the river was rising, the beach could be completely underwater in an hour or two. And if the rain continued into the next day, the situation would only get worse. They began to break camp in the middle of the tempest. First, they gathered everything that was loose: pots, canteens, food bags. Then they folded the sleeping bags while still inside the tent to keep them dry. Finally, they dismantled the structure and rolled everything into a waterproof tarp. But that's when they ran into their first serious problem. In the driving rain and the weak light of their flashlights, Lydia stepped awkwardly on a wet rock and twisted her left ankle. It wasn't a severe injury, but it was enough to make her limp and slow her down. Rogério helped her up and decided he would carry her backpack as well. The second problem arose when they tried to find the trail back. With the torrential rain and poor visibility, the landmarks they had used during the day had vanished. The rocks that had served as markers were now submerged, and their points of reference were lost in the wet darkness. Rogério consulted the compass, trying to hold a northeasterly course, the direction from which they had come, but trekking through the downpour burdened by 2 backpacks while supporting Lydia was far more grueling than he had imagined. With every step, their boots slid in the slick red mud that now coated the paths. It was only when they reached the river's edge that the true gravity of their situation became clear. The water, which by day had been crystal clear and tranquil, now raged, a muddy, furious torrent churning with branches, leaves, and debris. The river had swelled by at least 1.5 meters, its current far stronger than either of them could possibly withstand. They had 2 choices: attempt to bypass the river by climbing over the higher rocks along its bank, or wait for the storm to subside and the water level to drop. Rogério chose the first. He knew of people who had been stranded for days in similar circumstances, and at their age, it was a risk he wasn't willing to take. They began to ascend the rocks at the river's edge, searching for a viable crossing point. Lydia moved slowly, her ankle throbbing, carefully testing each foothold before shifting her weight. Rogério went ahead, carrying both packs, holding her hand through the most treacherous sections. His headlamp began to sputter. The battery was dying, its beam flickering intermittently, casting confusing, dancing shadows across the wet stones. Lydia retrieved her own headlamp from her pack to help, but they quickly realized they had forgotten to change its batteries as well. It was in one of those fleeting, disorienting flashes of light that the inexplicable happened. Rogério was testing a smooth rock with his foot when it gave way. Or perhaps he simply slipped. The first thing Lydia heard was a sickening thud, like the sound of a body hitting water. When she aimed her failing light downward, she saw nothing. She screamed his name again and again, but her voice was swallowed by the deafening roar of the river and the rain. She tried to scramble down the rocks to search for him, but with her injured ankle and the heavy packs, she nearly slipped herself. And then the realization hit her. She was alone in the middle of a storm with no bearings and failing equipment. Desperation seized her. She kept shouting, her weak beam cutting uselessly through the darkness, but there was no sign of Rogério. The river was so high, so violent, that if he had fallen in, the current could have swept him miles away in mere minutes. Lydia remained there for over an hour, calling out, waiting for a reply that never came. When her headlamp finally died, she was plunged into absolute darkness, with only the sound of the storm and the crushing feeling of being utterly lost. It was the last time anyone knew of her whereabouts with any certainty. The next morning, when the rain finally ceased, the park staff would make a discovery that would turn a weekend adventure into an investigation spanning years. The morning of November 26th dawned with the clean, sharp light that always follows a storm. The sky was a flawless blue, and the air smelled of wet earth and freshly washed leaves. To anyone unaware of the night's events, It seemed a perfect Sunday in the Chapada dos Veadeiros. Carlos Roberto da Silva, a park ranger with 12 years of experience, began his 7 a.m. patrol just as he did every weekend. He knew every trail, every waterfall, every clearing where visitors liked to camp. After a heavy rain, he always checked for fallen trees blocking the paths or dangerous sections that needed to be marked. It was on his way down the Seven Falls Trail that he noticed the first footprints in the mud. Two sets of trekking boot prints, different sizes, heading toward the waterfalls, nothing unusual. He often found tracks from campers, but these caught his attention because they were remarkably clear, as if made during or just after the rain. Arriving at the small, sandy area known as the Little Beaches, Carlos found something that made him stop dead. A tent, still standing but bearing the clear signs of a hasty abandonment. The rainfly was askew, one of the guy lines had snapped and gear was strewn about. A half-open beige backpack, an overturned aluminum pot, the remains of a fire extinguished hours ago. What stood out most was a headlamp lying in the mud, its batteries missing, and a translucent blue water bottle hanging from a low branch, as if left there in a rush. Carlos knew the signs. In his 12 years, he had seen similar scenes, people who fled their camp because of a sudden storm or an animal, only to return later for their belongings. But something about this felt wrong. The tent was only partially secured, as if it had been hastily taken down and then abandoned mid-task. Inside, Carlos found two neatly folded sleeping bags, dry clothes organized in plastic sacks, and a small notebook with handwritten entries. It was while leafing through the notebook that he found their names: Rogério Silva Mendes and Lídia Marques Mendes from Brasília. The last entry was dated November 25th. Perfect day. Tomorrow we'll see the viewpoint. Below it, in a different, frantic script: heavy rain, 3 a.m., Rogério in the water, I don't know where I am. A chill ran down Carlos's spine. He returned to the area near the river and began a more careful search. The water level was still high, but it was clear that during the night it had been much higher. Marks on the bank showed that the flood had covered part of the beach where the tent was pitched. Following the footprints in the mud, he found more evidence. The tracks led to a rocky area near the river, where they became jumbled before disappearing altogether. There were signs that someone had tried to cross or bypass the river along the rocks. One of them, a smooth, slanted stone, bore fresh scuff marks, as if someone had slipped there. Carlos radioed the park base. Within 15 minutes, 2 more rangers and the emergency coordinator arrived. They cordoned off the area and began a systematic search around the campsite for any sign of its owners. Their first step was to check the park's entry log. It was confirmed. Rogério and Lídia had checked in on Friday with a planned return for early Sunday. It was now noon on Sunday, and there was no sign of them at the parking lot or the entrance. At 2 p.m., they alerted the fire department in Alto Paraíso. The water rescue team arrived half an hour later with 2 search dogs. They started at the river, where the evidence suggested at least one person had fallen in during the storm. The dogs followed a scent trail to the riverbank, where it vanished completely. One of the firefighters, a veteran of rescues in the Chapada, explained that with the volume of rain and the high water level, anyone who fell in could have been carried for kilometers. They organized teams to scour the downstream banks and the nearby forest, in case someone had managed to get out of the water and become lost. Volunteers from the nearby towns of Alto Paraíso and São Jorge joined the search. Within hours, more than 20 people were looking for the missing couple. Throughout the afternoon, they covered more than 5 kilometers of the riverbank, checking natural pools, ledges where a person might have clung, and eddies where a body could have been trapped. Nothing. The river was clear, with no sign of the missing pair. As the day wore on, the most likely hypothesis began to solidify. Rogério and Lídia had tried to flee the camp during the storm. One of them fell into the swollen river, the other tried to help, and the current had claimed them both. It was a tragic explanation, but it fit the evidence. At 6 p.m., they suspended the search until the following day. Carlos was tasked with safeguarding the equipment found at the camp: the backpacks, clothes, food, the notebook with its chilling final entry. Everything would be examined by the police to piece together what had happened during that stormy night. On Monday, the search resumed, reinforced by divers and a military police helicopter. They explored deeper pools, checked caves near the river, and followed its course for more than 10 kilometers. The result was the same. No sign of Rogério and Lídia. The police chief of Alto Paraíso opened an official inquiry on Tuesday. The evidence pointed to accidental death by drowning. But without bodies, the case could not be closed. The equipment, after being photographed and catalogued, was released to the family. Their gray Palio remained in the park's parking lot for 2 weeks until Ogi Sakuya Tukumchis, till Lídia's sister came to retrieve it. But what no one knew then was that the river had guarded the secrets of Rogério and Lídia, hiding them deep within its grasp, and it would be 4 years before it returned even a part of them, in a way no one ever expected. Over the next 3 years, the disappearance of Rogério and Lídia Mendes became one of those stories that circulated among park employees and local guides. Everyone in Alto Paraíso and São Jorge knew the case of the couple from Brasília who vanished during the storm in November of 2000. Lídia's sister, Helena Marquez, never fully accepted the official story. Every 3 or 4 months, she would make the trip from Brasília to the Chapada to speak with anyone who might have new information. She talked to woodsmen, guest house owners, anyone who had been in the region that weekend. In May of 2001, Helena thought she had found a significant lead. A used equipment dealer in a nearby town claimed someone had tried to sell a large navy blue trekking backpack, very similar to Rogério's. But when she went to inspect it, she discovered it was a different model, much newer than her brother-in-law's. The summer rains of 2001, 2002, and 2003 always rekindled the family's hope. After every major storm, Helena would call the park, asking if anything new had surfaced. The answer was always the same. The teams conducted routine searches after the floods but never found any objects or evidence related to the missing couple. What the family didn't understand was how the Rio Preto and its tributaries functioned as a complex system for transporting and retaining material. The oldest park employees, through decades of work in the Chapada, had learned that the river would swallow things during floods only to sometimes spit them back out years later in completely different places. Carlos Roberto, the ranger who had found the abandoned camp, would explain it to anyone who would listen. "This river has its ways," he'd say. "I've seen a backpack that vanished near the Seven Falls reappear 5 kilometers downstream 3 years later. The water digs out caves under the bank's hidden places. When a big flood comes, it carries away everything that was trapped inside." That was exactly what was happening with the remains of Rogério and Lídia, though no one knew it. During floods, the current would carve subterranean tunnels into the riverbanks. These tunnels acted as natural traps, capturing heavy objects during the deluge and holding them for months or even years, until a more significant erosion event set them free. The process was slow and unpredictable. Water would force its way under exposed roots, creating hollow chambers in the compacted earth, and then deposit whatever the current carried: branches, stones, organic matter, lost equipment. When the water level receded, these objects would remain trapped in pockets of mud and sediment. In 2002, a particularly strong flood nearly exposed something important. A group of volunteers cleaning the riverbanks found shreds of yellow tarp buried in an embankment, about 4 kilometers from the campsite. But the pieces were small and faded. They could have been from any old, abandoned camp. Helena even went to see them, but she couldn't determine if they were connected to her sister's gear. The tarp was too deteriorated, with no markings or features to link it to Rogério and Lídia. The volunteers collected the fragments along with other debris and took them to the local landfill. What they didn't realize was that more material was buried in that same embankment. Much more. But it would take an even greater erosion to expose what truly mattered. During 2003, Helena's visits to the Chapada became less frequent. Her grief had evolved into a melancholic acceptance, and she began to focus on organizing the things Rogério and Lídia had left behind in their apartment. Photographs, books, the maps Rogério collected, the art projects Lídia had saved from her students. It was while sorting through these belongings that Helena discovered something she never knew existed. Her sister had kept a detailed journal of every hike she and Rogério took. Each trip had a date, location, equipment used, observations about the weather, and even simple sketches of places they loved. The last entry was from September 2000, 2 months before they disappeared. Lídia had written about their visit to the Seven Falls and their desire to return to camp there. Rogério wants to hear the river at dawn. So do I. We'll plan an overnight trip before the summer, just the two of us, no rush. Even more interesting were the technical details Lídia recorded. She described every piece of their equipment, noted where they bought their supplies, and even logged the car's mileage and fuel costs. It was a meticulous record that could prove invaluable for identifying any materials found in the future. Helena stored the journal with the last developed photos of the couple. She had a feeling, an intuition, that one day these organized records would be important. She didn't know that in just a few short months that intuition would be confirmed in a way she could never have imagined. The summer straddling 2003 and 2004 brought unusually heavy rains to the Chapada region. Rainfall was nearly double the historical average between December and February. The rivers swelled, their currents growing stronger and more violent than usual, and warnings of flash floods were issued frequently along the main trails. Then, in January of 2004, one particular storm changed everything. It was unlike any other. It didn't last long, but its intensity was ferocious. In less than 6 hours, an entire month's worth of rain fell. The sheer volume of water cascading down the slopes reshaped riverbanks and tore away layers of earth that had lain undisturbed for years. The morning after the storm, a group of volunteers set out to do their routine work, checking the trails for damage and clearing debris washed ashore by the floodwaters. These were locals who performed this task regularly. They knew every stone, every curve of the river. It was Roberto Alves, a retiree from Alto Paraíso and a volunteer for over a decade, who saw it first. He was walking along the bank of a tributary of the Rio Preto, in an area seldom visited, when he noticed something strange tangled in the roots of a large tree from a distance. It looked like a rotten log or a garbage bag swept downstream. But as he drew closer, Roberto realized it was something else. Something that made him stop dead in his tracks and call out to the other volunteers scattered across the area. What they found on that January morning in 2004 would reopen a case long considered closed, raising questions no one knew how to answer. A bundle. That was the first thing Roberto Alves thought when he saw the object caught in the tree's roots. It was an elongated bundle about 5.5 feet long and a foot in diameter, wrapped in a tattered, ancient-looking yellow tarp. But this was no ordinary bundle. Thick, rust-darkened chains were wrapped around its entire length, coiling several times around the tarp as if someone had taken great care to bind it securely. And at both ends of the chains, heavy stones were attached, ballast clearly intended to weigh it down. Roberto called over the other 2 volunteers who were nearby, Donna Marlene, the group's coordinator for years, and João Carlos, a young man from São Jorge who always joined the cleanups. The three of them stood there staring at the strange object, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The yellow tarp was badly decayed. Large tears revealed what was inside, a dark, waterlogged fabric that looked like a sleeping bag. The entire thing was caked in mud, clinging leaves, and the dark patina that objects acquire after being submerged for a long time. But it was the chains that were most striking. They were heavy-duty, the kind used in construction. They were completely rusted but still solid, and the way they were wrapped around the bundle was clearly not accidental. Someone had bound it purposefully, carefully, wanting it to stay sealed. Donna Marlene, a retired nurse with a knack for handling difficult situations, was the first to voice what they were all thinking. "This isn't right," she said. "We need to call the police before we touch anything." João Carlos suggested it might just be garbage, something someone had tried to sink in the river. But Roberto, who had known the region for decades, knew better. "Chains like these are expensive," he said. "Nobody would just throw them away, and these rocks, someone did this to make it sink and stay sunk." They decided not to touch it. Donna Marlene, who always carried a disposable camera, took a few pictures, and they carefully marked the spot. The bundle was wedged in the roots of a large fig tree where the floodwaters had carved out a steep embankment. It was clear that the previous night's erosion had stripped away part of the bank, revealing layers of earth that had been buried for a long time. While João Carlos headed to São Jorge to notify the authorities, Roberto and Donna Marlene stayed behind to guard the site. They walked around the tree searching for anything else that might be buried nearby. They found nothing obvious, but they noticed the bank had several spots where the earth looked like it had been disturbed by the water over many years. "This river is a treacherous thing," Roberto remarked. "Swallows things in one place and spits them out in another. I've seen all sorts of things surface after a storm." He fell silent, his gaze fixed on the bundle. Something about the scene was unsettling him, but he couldn't quite place it. It was Donna Marlene who put the unspoken fear into words. "Roberto," she asked softly, "do you remember that couple who went missing here a few years back? The ones from Brasilia?" He did. Everyone in the region knew the story of Rogério and Lídia Mendes. "You think this could be related?" The question hung in the air as they waited for the police. It was a disturbing possibility, but one that made a chilling kind of sense. If this was connected to the missing couple, it meant someone had found their bodies. And instead of alerting the authorities, that person had decided to bind them and try to make them vanish forever. Around 2 in the afternoon, the police chief from Alto Paraíso arrived with 2 detectives. They secured the area with yellow tape and began meticulously photographing everything before touching a thing. The chief, Dr. Marcelo Cunha, was an experienced officer familiar with the region's cases, including the story of the missing couple. "You did the right thing by not touching it," he told the volunteers. "This could be important evidence. Any mistake could compromise the investigation." The detectives measured the bundle, documented the position of the chains, and photographed the knots in the ropes securing the stones. Every detail was recorded before they began to move the object. It was a delicate task. The material was so fragile it could disintegrate if handled hastily. When they finally managed to free the bundle from the roots, they realized it was much heavier than it appeared. The stones tied to the ends weighed about 30 pounds each, and the contents were substantial as well. It took 4 people to carry it to the police vehicle. Dr. Cunha decided against opening the bundle on site. It was better to take it to the Forensic Institute in Goiânia, where they had the proper facilities to conduct a controlled opening and preserve any potential evidence inside. On the drive to the city, the chief called Helena Marques in Brasilia. He explained that they had found something that might be related to the disappearance of Rogério and Lídia, but that nothing could be confirmed yet. He urged her not to get her hopes up, but to prepare herself for the possibility of definitive news about her sister and brother-in-law. Helena listened in silence. After 4 years of uncertainty, a part of her wanted to believe they would finally know what had happened. Another part was terrified of what they might discover. "Chief," she asked, her voice trembling, "do you think they suffered?" It was a question Dr. Cunha had no answer for. Only the forensic examination could reveal what had truly happened on that November night in 2000, and why someone had bound the remains of 2 people in chains and tried to make them disappear forever at the bottom of a river. The Forensic Institute in Goiânia received the package on a Thursday afternoon. Dr. Paulo Henrique Moreira, a forensic expert with 20 years of experience, took on the case personally. He had handled similar situations before, but rarely had he seen something so meticulously packaged. His first decision was not to open the bundle immediately. He wanted to run a CT scan first to get an idea of the contents without compromising the integrity of any evidence inside. It was standard procedure in complex cases: first map, then open. The scan's images revealed outlines that confirmed their worst fears. There was bone material inside, clearly human, scattered irregularly throughout the bundle. Even more interesting, the images showed small metallic objects, possibly buckles, buttons, or camping gear mixed in with the bones. On Friday morning, Dr. Moreira began the controlled opening. He started by carefully cutting through one of the chains. The metal was so corroded that it broke easily with a standard pair of pliers, releasing a sharp smell of rust and decomposed organic matter. The yellow tarp was in terrible condition, crumbling at a touch, with dark stains that could have been ancient blood or simply the result of natural decay. Once he removed it, Dr. Moreira found a dark, mummy-style sleeping bag, also severely deteriorated. Opening the sleeping bag made the situation tragically clear. Inside, mixed with river sediment and plant debris, were the bones of 2 separate individuals. Their proportions and size indicated an adult male and an adult female, likely in their 50s or 60s. The condition of the bones was poor, as expected. Many were fragmented, some showing clear signs of abrasion from being carried by the water current. But there was enough material to attempt an identification. Along with the bones, Dr. Moreira found other significant items: pieces of paracord, a simple, heavily corroded carabiner, fragments of green foam that could have been from a sleeping pad, and, most tellingly, small, dark necklace beads identical to those seen in photographs of the missing couple. But the most crucial discovery was on the sleeping bag's inner lining. There, protected by the double layer of fabric, was an identification tag. On it, still legible, were the initials LM, handwritten in permanent marker. The ink was faded, but unmistakable. Dr. Moreira photographed everything. Each bone was cleaned, measured, and catalogued. The personal items were separated and individually packaged. The entire process took 3 days of meticulous work, ensuring no detail was lost. The bone analysis revealed important information. In the female's remains, a fragment of the upper jawbone showed an old composite resin filling, a type of dental work characteristic of the 1990s. For the male, the evidence was more circumstantial. An estimated height between 5'7" and 5'9", and an age consistent with the 58 years Rogério was when he disappeared. What puzzled Dr. Moreira most was the absence of any clear signs indicating the cause of death. If the 2 had drowned, there would be no obvious marks on the bones, but the way the bodies had been packaged raised disturbing questions. Someone had found the remains, placed them inside the sleeping bag, wrapped it all in the tarp, and bound it with heavy chains. This was not the act of someone in a panic. Dr. Morera contacted Helena Marquez to request medical and dental records for Rogério and Lídia. While waiting, he took a closer look at the objects found with the bones. The carabiner was a simple type used for basic camping gear. The necklace beads were plastic, painted black, identical to those in the last photos of the couple. The paracord fragments were particularly interesting. Some pieces still had knots, suggesting they had been cut from larger pieces of equipment, possibly the very equipment the couple had been carrying on their last trip. By the end of the week, Dr. Morera was morally certain that the remains belonged to Rogério and Lídia Mendes. The circumstantial evidence was overwhelming, but he still needed formal confirmation. The great, unanswered question remained: who had bound the bodies in such a way, and when? The chains and stones had not gotten there by accident. Someone had made a deliberate effort to hide the remains. The question was, why? Helena Marquez drove to Goiânia on a Monday morning, carrying a folder with all the medical documents she could find. Lídia's dental records, old x-rays of Rogério, even eyeglass prescriptions. The meeting with Dr. Morera was tense. Helena knew she was finally about to get definitive answers, but she also knew those answers could be more disturbing than the 4 years of uncertainty. "Mrs. Marquez," Dr. Morera began, choosing his words carefully, "the evidence strongly indicates that we have found the remains of Rogério and Lídia, but there are complicated aspects to this case." The comparison of the dental records was conclusive. The restoration found on the jaw fragment was identical to the work done on Lídia's tooth in 1998. There was no possible doubt. One of the individuals was Lídia Marquez Mendes. For Rogério, the confirmation was more indirect but equally compelling. The skeletal measurements matched his height and build. More importantly, among the objects found was a fragment of an eyeglass frame with a prescription that matched the one Helena had brought. "So, they really died that night?" Helena asked. Dr. Morera hesitated before answering. "That is the complicated part, Mrs. Marquez. They likely died around the time of their disappearance, yes. But someone had found the bodies later and had taken great care to hide them in a very specific way." He explained the chains, the stones tied as ballast, the meticulous manner in which the remains had been wrapped. This was not the kind of thing that happens naturally in a river, not even after years of erosion and sediment transport. Helena listened in sonde, struggling to process the information. "Doctor," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "are you saying that someone found my sister and brother-in-law dead, and instead of notifying the police decided to hide their bodies?" "It's a possibility," Dr. Paulo replied, "or someone was involved in their deaths from the very beginning and only secured them this way later. Unfortunately, after so much time submerged, it's impossible to determine the exact cause of death or when precisely they were bound." Delegate Marcelo Cunha, who had been listening quietly, explained that the inquiry would be reopened. They now had physical evidence that Rogério and Lídia were truly dead, but they also had evidence that someone had tampered with the bodies post-mortem. "We will investigate every possibility," he said. "It could have been someone who found the bodies weeks after the disappearance and was afraid to get involved. Or it could have been someone who was there on the night of the storm and never told the truth." Helena asked to see the personal items that had been recovered. Dr. Paulo showed her the beads from the necklace, the fragments of camping gear, the tag bearing her sister's initials. They were small things, but they confirmed that these were indeed the remains of the people she loved. What disturbed her most was the thought of someone finding Rogério and Lídia dead and choosing to hide them, rather than giving them a proper burial. "What kind of person does something like that?" she asked, her voice a whisper. Delegate Cunha had a few theories. It could have been someone engaged in illegal activities in the area at the time, afraid of being implicated, or someone who found the bodies under circumstances that might have looked suspicious and they panicked. Another darker possibility was that someone was directly involved in the couple's death and had bound the bodies to ensure they would never be found. The chains and stones indicated careful planning, not an impulsive reaction. Helena wanted to know if there was any chance of finding out who had done it. Delegate Cunha was honest. After 4 years, the chances are slim. There are no witnesses, no physical evidence that points to a specific person, and the river itself has washed away any potential tracks. But we will try, he promised. We'll speak again with everyone who was in the region at that time. Review every statement, see if anyone remembers something they didn't mention before. What troubled the investigators most was the method. Using chains and stones to sink a body requires knowledge of how rivers work. It wasn't something an ordinary person would do instinctively. Dr. Paulo explained that whoever bound the bodies knew the river had deep pools where things could remain trapped for years. They also knew that heavy chains were necessary to keep the remains at the bottom, even during violent floods. This was someone who knew the region well, he concluded, likely a local who had experience with the river's behavior throughout the year. Helena returned to Brasilia with more questions than answers. She finally knew that Rogério and Lídia were dead, but now she had to live with the idea that someone had deliberately hidden their bodies, depriving the family of a proper farewell. In the following days, she organized the funeral she couldn't have 4 years earlier. It was a simple ceremony with friends and colleagues who remembered the couple. They spoke of the trails they loved to hike, their shared passion for nature, the plans they had for retirement. But in the back of Helena's mind, the question that might never be answered lingered. Who was the person who knew what had happened to Rogério and Lídia and chose to keep that secret at the bottom of the river? Delegate Marcelo Cunha officially reopened the inquiry in March of 2004. It was no longer just a possible accident during a storm, but a criminal investigation involving the concealment of bodies and possibly homicide. The first step was to reconduct all the interviews from 2000, park employees, firefighters who had participated in the searches, tourists who were in the area that weekend. The delegate wanted to know if anyone had seen any unusual activity in the days following the couple's disappearance. Carlos Roberto, the employee who found the abandoned campsite, was one of the first to be called in. He recalled every detail he could from the morning of November 26th. The position of the gear, the footprints in the mud, the signs that someone had left in a hurry during the storm. One thing always puzzled me, Carlos said. The way some of the equipment was left behind. If they were running from the rain, why didn't they take the woman's backpack? Why was his water bottle still hanging from the tree? It was an important observation. It suggested that perhaps the couple hadn't left the campsite voluntarily, or that something had happened during their attempt to flee that prevented them from taking all their gear. Dr. Cunha also wanted to re-interview the young couple who had been the last to see Rogério and Lídia alive. They lived in Goiânia and remembered the encounter on the trail well. They described the couple as calm, well-equipped, and seemingly experienced. They looked like they knew what they were doing, the woman said. They weren't inexperienced tourists, which is why we were so shocked when we heard they had disappeared. The man added a detail he hadn't mentioned in the first interview. I remember them saying they wanted to avoid other people. They said they chose that weekend specifically because it wasn't a holiday and the trails would be emptier. It was possible that this preference for isolation had made the couple more vulnerable. If someone had ill intentions, it would be easier to act against two people who had deliberately moved away from populated areas. Delegate Cunha expanded the investigation to include people who frequented the region regularly: woodsmen, guides, local merchants, even squatters living in more remote parts of the Chapada. He wanted to map out who had enough knowledge of the river to bind bodies in the way they were found. It was during a conversation with a retired woodsman that an interesting lead emerged. Sir Joaquim, who had known the Chapada for over 40 years, said that the technique of using chains and stones was common among illegal hunters in the region. When they killed a big animal out of season, sometimes they'd sink the evidence just like that, he explained. Heavy chain, a rock tied to it, and they'd throw it in a deep pool. It was a way to make sure it never surfaced. The information was valuable because it suggested a specific profile, someone accustomed to illegal activities in the forest who knew how to hide evidence efficiently. This was not the behavior of an ordinary person in a state of panic. Dr. Cunha began to investigate whether there were records of illegal activities in the region during the period of the disappearance: poaching, illegal logging, cultivation of prohibited plants in remote areas. Anything that could explain the presence of people with experience in concealing evidence. He found that in 2000 there had been some reports of illegal hunting in the Chapada area, but nothing that led to the identification of specific suspects. Enforcement was limited, and many illegal activities occurred without leaving an official trace. A particularly promising line of inquiry emerged when Dr. Cunha learned that some local residents had seen strange activity on the river a few days after the storm. Nothing specific, just people walking in areas where there was normally no foot traffic. Donna Mercedes, who lived in an isolated house near the park, remembered hearing a motor one night about 3 or 4 days after the storm. It sounded like a small boat, the kind for fishing, she recalled, but it was strange because it wasn't fishing season, and the river was still very murky. The information was vague, but it suggested that someone had used a boat to move on the river during the period when the bodies might have been handled. It was possible that Rogério and Lídia's remains had been transported by water to the place where they were bound and sunk. Dr. Cunha tried to identify who had access to small boats in the region at that time. He found a few fishermen and rural landowners, but none who seemed particularly suspicious or whose behavior had changed after the couple's disappearance. The main problem with the investigation was the passage of time. 4 years was a long time for memories to remain accurate and for physical evidence to survive. Any trail that could have led to those responsible had likely vanished. Still, Delegate Cunha kept searching. He knew that crimes of this nature rarely remained completely without a trace. There was always someone who knew something. Some detail that hadn't been revealed, some change in behavior that could indicate involvement. A more detailed investigation revealed that the area where the film canister was found in 2004 was approximately 6 kilometers downriver from Rogério and Lídia's campsite. It was a considerable distance, but consistent with natural transport by the current during the floods of the subsequent years. Dr. Cunha consulted with hydrology experts to better understand how heavy objects move in the region's rivers. He learned that underwater currents and eddies can hold materials for long periods, releasing them only when major erosion alters the riverbed. It's possible the bodies were bound and sunk near the campsite, one of the experts explained. Over the years, the floods carried the entire bundle to where it was found, following the natural dynamics of the river. This information shifted the focus of the investigation. If the bodies had originally been sunk near the 7 falls, any suspect must have had access to that specific area in the days or weeks following the disappearance. Dr. Cunha went back to interviewing park employees and local residents. this time asking specifically about movement in the waterfall area during December 2000 and January 2001. He wanted to know if anyone had noticed strangers, unusual equipment, or suspicious activities. A retired employee remembered finding signs of a campfire in an unauthorized location during a patrol in December 2000. It was near the falls in an area where there shouldn't have been a camp, but when I got there, no one was around, just cold ashes and some footprints in the mud. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it. Tourists sometimes camped in prohibited places and left before being caught. But now, in light of the discovery of the bound remains, that clandestine campsite took on a new significance. The footprints were from boots, not hiking sneakers, the employee recalled, and it looked like the person had stayed there more than one night. There were buried food scraps and signs that someone had disturbed the vegetation. Dr. Kuna asked the employee to show him exactly where this irregular camp had been. The spot was less than 500 meters from where Rogério and Lídia had pitched their tent on the night they disappeared. It was an area with difficult access, not visible from the main trails, but it offered a clear view of the small beach, where the couple from Brasilia had camped. Anyone positioned there could have observed their activities without being noticed. The discovery raised a disturbing possibility. What if someone had been watching Rogério and Lídia before the storm? What if what happened that night was not an accident, but something planned? Dr. Cunha expanded the scope of the investigation again. He began to check for records of similar crimes in other camping areas in the region. He wanted to know if there was a precedent for people attacking isolated couples at campsites. He found nothing directly related, but he did uncover a few cases of camping equipment theft on more remote trails. They always followed the same pattern. Couples or small groups camped far from busy areas, losing equipment during the night. The difference in Rogério and Lídia's case was that the equipment had been left behind, not stolen. This suggested that the motive was not economic, or that something had gone wrong during a possible robbery. Dr. Kuna spent months following these leads, interviewing dozens of people and reviewing old park and local police records. But he always ran into the same problem: a lack of concrete evidence linking any specific suspect to the couple's disappearance. By the end of 2004, the delegate had to admit the investigation was at a standstill. They had confirmed that Rogério and Lídia died at the time of their disappearance, and that someone had deliberately hidden their bodies, but they couldn't identify who had done it or why. "The case remains open," he informed Helena. "Any new information will be investigated, but unfortunately, after so much time, the chances of finding those responsible are small." Helena accepted this reality with resignation. At least now she knew her sister and brother-in-law were dead and not suffering somewhere unknown. But the question of who had hidden their bodies would remain unanswered, a secret buried in the murky waters of the Preto River. The case of Rogério and Lídia Mendes became one of those mysteries destined to remain unsolved. In 2005, the inquiry was archived for lack of sufficient evidence to indict any specific suspect, though it remained officially open in case new evidence ever surfaced. Helena Marques organized a simple funeral in Brasilia. The remains of Rogério and Lídia were cremated, and their ashes were scattered in an ecological reserve near the capital, a place they used to visit on weekends when they were still alive. It was a small ceremony with only close friends and a few colleagues who remembered the couple. During the service, several people shared memories of Rogério and Lídia. They spoke of their shared passion for the trails, of the meticulous care with which they planned each journey, of the dreams they held for retirement. No one mentioned the mysterious circumstances of their death, nor the questions that still hung unanswered in the air. In the Chapada dos Veadeiros, the story of the missing couple continued to circulate among park employees, local guides, and longtime tourists. Each person recounted the version they knew, and with the passage of time, the details shifted, creating variations of the original tale. Some said the couple had been victims of a robbery. Others suggested they had become lost in the storm, succumbing to cold and hunger. There were even those who whispered they had taken their own lives in a suicide pact, their bodies found later by chance. Each version attempted to explain the one chilling detail that defied simple logic: why their remains had been bound in chains and sunk in the river. Carlos Roberto, the employee who found the abandoned campsite, retired in 2006. Before leaving the park, he made a point of recording everything he remembered about the morning of November 26, 2000 in the official archives. He wanted future generations of employees to know exactly what had been found and how. Maybe one day someone will confess what really happened, he said. Or maybe new evidence will appear, something we couldn't see at the time. That's why it's important to have everything documented properly. Roberto Alves, the volunteer who discovered the canvas roll in 2004, continued to take part in the river cleanups until 2010, whenever he passed the spot where he had made the discovery. He would pause for a few minutes, his gaze lost in the water, pondering the secrets the river might still be keeping. "This river has seen many things over the years," he used to tell the other volunteers, "and sometimes it decides to give back a piece of what it holds. You never know when something else might turn up." Indeed, in the years that followed, other old objects were found on the banks after heavy storms: deteriorated camping equipment, scraps of clothing, even the remains of ancient campfires exposed by erosion, but nothing that could be specifically linked to the case of Rogério and Lídia. Dr. Marcelo Cunha retired from the civil police in 2012. The case of the couple from Brasilia remained one of the few mysteries he had failed to completely solve during his career. Before leaving his post, he organized all the investigation documents into a special file, hoping that a future investigator might find the clues he had missed. "Perfect crimes don't exist," he often said. "There's always a trace, always someone who knows something. The problem is, sometimes it takes a very long time for that information to come to light." Helena Marquez continued to live in the apartment where Rogério and Lídia had spent so many years. She kept the photographs from their hikes, the maps Rogério collected, and the diary where Lídia noted the details of each trip. Occasionally, she would receive calls from people claiming to have information, but they always turned out to be false leads or unfounded theories. In 2010, she decided to make one last visit to the Chapada dos Veadeiros. She went alone, driving the same route her sister and brother-in-law had taken 10 years earlier. She walked the Sete Quedas trail and visited the small beach where they had camped for the last time. For a few minutes, she stood listening to the sound of the water rushing over the stones. It wasn't a nostalgic or emotional visit. Helena simply wanted to say a final goodbye to that place and to the questions that would never be answered. Rogério and Lídia are at peace now, she thought, and maybe it's better this way. Before leaving, she spoke with a few park employees who still remembered the case. They were all respectful and understanding, but no one had any new information. The mystery remained exactly as it was in 2004, only partially solved. During the drive back to Brasilia, Helena reflected on how life can change so unexpectedly. 10 years before, Rogério and Lídia were a happy couple, planning adventures for their retirement. Now they were just a sad story that a few people still remembered. But perhaps the true lesson of the case was something else: that secrets are buried everywhere, that not everything that happens leaves a clear trail, and that sometimes the most important questions are the ones we can never answer. The Prado River continued to flow, carrying sediment and memories, guarding some secrets and revealing others according to its own natural logic. and somewhere in the depths of its murky waters, perhaps there were still answers that no one would ever find. In January of 2015, nearly 15 years after the disappearance of Rogério and Lídia, an unexpected discovery briefly rekindled interest in the case. During maintenance work on a bridge over a tributary of the Preto River, workers found a beige canvas backpack buried in the riverbank. It was in poor condition, but it was still possible to identify features that matched the description of the one Lídia had carried: medium-sized, faded beige, with adjustable straps. Inside, protected by plastic bags that had miraculously remained sealed, were a few personal items. The most significant find was a small notebook filled with Lydia's unmistakable handwriting. The pages were damp and some words were blurred, but much of the content was still legible. There were observations about plants and animals seen on the trails, equipment lists, and even a few simple sketches of landscapes. Helena, then 72 years old, was called to identify the objects. She immediately recognized her sister's handwriting and confirmed that several items belonged to Lídia: a small pair of field binoculars, a flask of homemade insect repellent, a few old coins, and a laminated identity card that was still readable. The discovery formally reopened the case for a few months. Dr. Julio Cesar Moraes, who had taken over the Alto Paraíso Police Department, ordered new searches in the area where the backpack was found. The hope was that other objects or evidence might have been preserved nearby. The searches lasted 2 weeks and involved divers, metal detectors, and careful excavations along the banks. They found some fabric fragments and pieces of corroded metal, but nothing that added relevant information to the case. The backpack, it seemed, had arrived there through the river's natural dynamics, not by human intervention. Dr. Julio re-interviewed people still living in the region who had some connection to the events of 2000. Most were now elderly or had moved away. Their memories were even vaguer, and no new details emerged. The case was permanently archived in December of 2015. Dr. Julio concluded in his final report, despite the efforts of multiple investigative teams over 15 years, there is insufficient evidence to determine the exact circumstances of the couple's death or to identify possible individuals responsible for the concealment of the bodies. We will likely never know the whole truth, but we can state with certainty that Rogério Silva Mendes and Lídia Marques Mendes died in November of 2000 in the Chapada dos Veadeiros region, and that someone deliberately hid their bodies. The identity of this person and their motives remain unknown. Helena kept the items recovered from the backpack, along with the other mementos of her sister. The notebook became especially precious, for it preserved Lydia's voice in a way that photographs could not. They were simple observations about the natural world, but they revealed the curiosity and affection she felt for nature. On the last page of the notebook was an entry dated November 23, 2000, the day before they vanished. Tomorrow, we will listen to the river at dawn. Rogério is anxious. I am too. It will be our first time sleeping so close to the water. I hope it is everything we have dreamed of. It was a discovery both sweet and bitter. It showed how happy and hopeful Rogério and Lídia were in their final hours, with no suspicion that this trip would be different from all the others they had taken together. The Chapada dos Veadeiros continued to welcome thousands of visitors each year. Most never learned the story of the couple from Brasilia who disappeared on a stormy night. To them, it was just another beautiful camping area with crystal-clear waterfalls and well-marked trails. But among the older park employees and local residents, the story of Rogério and Lídia stayed alive. It became a kind of local legend, the case of the couple who vanished during a storm and whose bodies were found in chains years later. Some versions of the story acquired fictional elements over time, speaking of hidden treasures, mysterious rituals, or ghosts that appeared on the trail during storms. But the people who truly knew the case understood that the truth was at once simpler and more disturbing. 2 people died. Someone hid their bodies, and we will never know who or why. Carlos Roberto, now long retired, would sometimes return to the park as a visitor. He always passed by the small beach where he had found the abandoned camp in 2000. The place was virtually unchanged, with only a few larger trees and the gravel rearranged by the annual floods. "This place holds a story we'll never fully know," he would reflect. "But maybe it's better that way. Some questions don't need answers. It's enough to know that 2 good people lost their lives here, and that someone, somewhere, carries that weight on their conscience." The last person to take an active interest in the case was a young journalist from Goiânia who, in 2018, attempted to produce a special report on the region's unsolved mysteries. He interviewed Helena, spoke with former investigators, and visited the relevant sites in the Chapada. But after months of research, he reached the same conclusion as everyone before him. There was enough evidence to confirm that something deliberate had happened, but not enough to identify those responsible or reconstruct the exact sequence of events. "Sometimes life is just like that," Helena told him when the journalist gave up on publishing the story. "Not everything has a clear explanation, and maybe Rogério and Lídia would prefer to be remembered for the beautiful trails they walked, not for the way they died." Today, more than 20 years after the disappearance of Rogério and Lídia Mendes, the Chapada dos Veadeiros remains one of Brazil's most sought-after tourist destinations. The trails have been improved, the signage is clearer, and safety procedures have been enhanced to prevent situations like the one that cost the couple their lives. Helena Marquez passed away in 2019 at the age of 76. She left all the documents related to her sister's case organized in a folder, which she donated to the Historical Archive of Alto Paraíso, in the hope that future generations might learn something from that unfinished story. The Preto River continues to run, shifting its course slightly with each flood, revealing and hiding secrets according to its own natural logic. Local fishermen sometimes find old objects caught in the rocks, deteriorated camping gear, rusted tools, scraps of clothing that no one can identify. Each discovery sparks curiosity about how many stories are buried on the banks of those murky waters. How many people have passed through? How many secrets have been carried away by the current? How many questions will remain forever unanswered? The case of Rogério and Lídia became a reminder that not all mysteries have a clear solution. Sometimes we know enough to understand that something happened, but not enough to fully explain how or why. And perhaps that uncertainty is an unavoidable part of the human experience. For the current park staff, the story of the missing couple is a lesson in vigilance and prevention. New protocols have been established to monitor visitors who camp alone in remote areas, and the registration system has been improved to facilitate searches in an emergency. But the question that haunted the investigation for years remains unanswered. Who bound the bodies of Rogério and Lídia with chains and tried to make them disappear at the bottom of the river? Was it someone they knew? A stranger who found them dead and panicked? A person with motives we will never uncover? The truth is, we will likely never know. Time has erased the physical evidence, witnesses have scattered or passed away, and the secrets are buried with those who kept them. But perhaps the most important lesson from the story of Rogério and Lídia is not about an unsolved mystery. Perhaps it is about 2 people who loved nature and died doing what they loved, who carefully planned a simple adventure and were overtaken by circumstances they could not control. They wanted to hear the sound of the river at dawn. They wanted to wake up with the sun rising between the waterfall rocks. They wanted to live quiet moments, far from the rush of Brasilia. And in a way, they achieved that, at least for a few hours before everything went wrong. The Chapada dos Veadeiros preserves their memory not through plaques or monuments, but through the continuity of the natural life they so cherished. The waters continue to flow, the birds continue to sing, the trails continue to lead people in search of peace and adventure. And somewhere in the depths of the Prito River, perhaps there are still secrets waiting to be revealed. Or perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, kept forever by the water that once swallowed two dreams and never gave back all the answers. The question that closes this story is the same one that haunted investigators for 2 decades. Who bound that which the river kept hidden for 4 long years? The answer may be buried forever in the murky waters of the Chapada, or it may lie in the conscience of someone who never found the courage to speak.